From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now! Protests are continuing in Wisconsin against what many see as a legislative coup, as Republican lawmakers are orchestrating an unprecedented power grab to weaken incoming Democratic Governor Tony Evers before he takes office. We'll get the latest. Then, as a national day of mourning is declared for the late President George H.W. Bush, we look back at the invasion of Iraq and the propaganda effort waged to build support for it.
The second week after the invasion, I volunteered at the Al-Adan hospital. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor.
President George H.W. Bush went on to cite Nayira's testimony at least 10 times as he made the case for war with Iraq. But her claims turned out to be false. In fact, Nayira was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. She'd been coached by the public relations firm Hill & Knowlton. We'll speak with Harper's Magazine's John MacArthur, author of Second Front, Censorship and Propaganda in the Gulf War. All that and more coming up. To Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. CIA Director Gina Haspel briefed a group of senators Tuesday on the murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. After the closed-door meeting, Republican Senator, chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Corker, told reporters he holds Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman directly responsible.
I have zero question in my mind that the Crown Prince, MBS, ordered the killing, monitored the killing, knew exactly what was happening, planned it in advance. If he was in front of a jury, he would be convicted in 30 minutes, guilty.
Republican South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham also condemned the Crown Prince and called out the Trump administration's handling of the case.
MBS, the Crown Prince, is a wrecking ball. I think he's complicit in the murder of Mr. Khashoggi to the highest level possible. I think the behavior before the Khashoggi murder was beyond disturbing, and I cannot see him being a reliable partner to the United States. Secretary Pompeo and Mattis are following the lead of the president. There's not a smoking gun, there's a smoking saw.
The smoking saw Graham is referring to is the bone saw that was reportedly used to dismember Khashoggi's body by Saudi hitmen in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul on October 2nd. CIA Director Haspel's briefing on Tuesday for a small group of senators came a week after the White House reportedly blocked her providing background to all the senators. This comes as the Senate is gearing up for a debate over whether to halt U.S. support for the Saudi-led war on Yemen after senators voted last week to advance a bipartisan resolution on the issue. The war has sparked what the UN calls the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with half of Yemen's 28 million people on the brink of famine. To see our conversation with Senator Bernie Sanders about Yemen and his bill, go to democracynow.org. In a sentencing memo filed Tuesday evening, Special Counsel Robert Mueller said he's not seeking jail time for former Trump National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, citing substantial assistance given to the ongoing probe into Russian meddling in the 2016 election and at least one other investigation. Large portions of the memo were heavily redacted, meaning Mueller's team is continuing to hide details of what it has uncovered. The memo also references Flynn's cooperation in a separate unidentified criminal investigation, details of which were blacked out. Politico is reporting the email accounts of 4 senior aides at the National Republican Congressional Committee were hacked in the lead-up to the 2018 midterm elections. The accounts were reportedly surveilled for several months. The NRCC first learned of the possible attack in April. They informed the FBI and launched an internal investigation, but senior Republican House leaders were not notified. Party officials believe the hack was perpetrated by a foreign agent. In Georgia, Republican Brad Raffensperger has won the runoff to become the next Secretary of State, filling the seat left vacant by Brian Kemp. Kemp, who was declared the winner in Georgia's contentious gubernatorial race, oversaw Georgia's controversial voting practices, which included efforts to suppress votes through the exact match system, which resulted in putting over 50,000 voter applications on hold because of minor discrepancies. Raffensperger is likely to continue many of his predecessors' practices. Last week, groups tied to Kemp's former opponent, Democrat Stacey Abrams, filed a federal lawsuit aiming to overhaul the Georgia election system. Meanwhile, in Wisconsin, the Republican-led legislature has been in session all night in an attempt to pass a series of bills to weaken the power of the incoming Democratic governor. We'll go to Wisconsin after headlines. 15 Congress members are calling for a probe into Labor Secretary Alex Acosta after an explosive report by the Miami Herald details his role in getting billionaire serial sexual abuser Jeffrey Epstein a plea deal in 2008 when Acosta was a U.S. attorney in Florida. The deal allowed Epstein to avoid a federal trial and possible life in prison and effectively ended an FBI probe into the case, which alleged Epstein sexually abused and trafficked dozens of underage girls. Epstein settled a defamation lawsuit against the lawyer of some of his accusers today, avoiding testimonies from survivors who are expected to take the stand in the coming days. A separate case to overturn the original 2008 plea deal is still pending. Meanwhile, an Inspector General report at the Justice Department reveals a senior official sexually assaulted, sexually harassed, and coerced multiple female subordinates and lied about it. The unnamed official was not prosecuted and was allowed to retire. President Trump has designated today a national day of mourning in honor of President George H.W. Bush. The federal government will be shut down, including the post office. Trading on the U.S. Stock Exchange will also be suspended. Funeral services will be held at the Washington National Cathedral. The United States is reestablishing a permanent diplomatic presence in Somalia nearly 30 years after it shut its embassy in Mogadishu in 1991 as the central government collapsed amidst a bloody civil war. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo gave Russia a 60-day deadline to start complying with the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, known as the INF, before the Trump administration follows through on their plan to withdraw from the agreement. Russia has also previously accused the U.S. of not complying with the treaty. The U.S. withdrawal was set to go into effect this week, but German Chancellor Angela Merkel and other European leaders reportedly convinced the U.S. to temporarily delay their plan. The INF was signed in 1987 and banned all nuclear and non-nuclear missiles with short and medium ranges. Many fear the U.S. withdrawal could spark a new arms race. Last week, the Washington Post reported National Security Advisor John Bolton signed a memo ordering the Pentagon to develop and deploy ground-launched missiles at the earliest possible date. In the West Bank, Israeli forces killed a man during an overnight raid in the city of Tulkarm Tuesday. Local media reports that 22-year-old Mohammed Habali was disabled and was walking with a cane at the time he was shot dead. Surveillance footage appears to show Habali walking away from the soldiers. Another man was wounded. 24 people were rounded up in the raids. In Geneva, United Nations brokered talks open today between the Kingdom of Morocco and the Western Saharan Liberation Movement known as the Polisario Front, aimed at resolving the 43-year-old conflict. Morocco has occupied Western Sahara since 1975. No other country in the world recognizes its sovereignty over the territory. Thousands of Western Sahara's indigenous people, the Sahrawi, have since been tortured, imprisoned, killed, and disappeared while resisting the Moroccan occupation. This week's talks also include representatives from Mauritania and Algeria. They're the first direct negotiations between the parties since 2012. Sahrawis are demanding a referendum on the status of the territory. Democracy Now! Was able to break the Moroccan media blockade and report from Western Sahara. You can go to our website at democracynow.org to watch our special report, 4 Days in Western Sahara, Africa's Last Colony. In Libya, 15 migrants died in a boat after spending 12 days at sea without food or water. 10 migrants survived. This is one of the survivors from Egypt.
We were 25 migrants on a boat, and we set off from the town of Sabrata. Everything was fine for about an hour, but after that, the boat started to malfunction. We drifted for about 12 days without food or water, and about 15 people died. We were only 10 people left when someone finally saw us near the shore. We spent 12 days without anything.
Migrants and human rights advocates have condemned Libya for gross human rights abuses against migrants, including torture, imprisonment, and slavery. Last month, a group of over 70 migrants refused to leave a docked ship in the Libyan port of Misrata before they were forcibly removed. The Attorneys General of the District of Columbia, Maryland, the state of Maine, and 5 federal agencies have sent subpoenas to the Trump Organization for financial documents relating to President Trump's business interests. The Trump Organization is accused of violating the Foreign Emoluments Clause of the Constitution by receiving payments from foreign governments through the Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C., and other establishments around the world. In Missouri, Springfield Police Chief Paul Williams has issued a video apology to rape victims after a damning CNN investigation revealed his police department routinely pressured survivors, neglected to interview suspects, and destroyed or left untested rape kits in cases that could have been prosecuted. Williams said he would make changes to the department's handling of rape cases, including halting the practice of having victims sign prosecution declination waivers. The New York Police Department announced it'll begin using drones. The NYPD says the drones will be used for search and rescue missions to investigate hazardous materials and to access crime scenes in tall buildings. The New York Civil Liberties Union said in response, quote, "The NYPD's drone policy places no meaningful restrictions on police deployment of drones in New York City and opens the door to the police department building a permanent archive of drone footage of political activity and intimate private behavior visible only from the sky." An investigation ordered by CBS reveals new details in the long-running sexual abuse committed by disgraced former CEO Les Moonves. The revelations include at least one board member's knowledge of sexual assault allegations against Moonves and an employee who was, quote, on call to perform oral sex. The report also says a resignation letter was drafted for Moonves by CBS's head of communications but was never signed. Moonves resigned in September after The New Yorker published an article detailing a slew of previously unreported sexual assault and sexual harassment allegations. Meanwhile, The New York Times is reporting Moonves destroyed evidence and lied to investigators to protect his reputation and a hefty severance package. In Texas, a Salvadoran mother and her 4-year-old son have been reunited under court order 8 months after immigration agents separated them at the border. The pair entered the country earlier this year seeking asylum from extreme violence and persecution, but were soon separated. 4 months ago, they were deemed ineligible to reunite due to a supposed arrest warrant in El Salvador. Recent reports reveal families are still being separated as they enter the U.S. months after a judge ordered a halt to the Trump administration's zero-tolerance policy. And students at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, are protesting the school's plan to relocate the Confederate statue known as Silent Sam to a new $5 million campus building. On Monday, UNC Chapel Hill student and activist Maya Little was charged with 2 misdemeanors, inciting a riot and assaulting an officer after a campus protest. Earlier this year, Maya Little poured her own blood and red paint on the statue. To see our interview with Little, go to our website at democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. We begin today's show in Wisconsin, where Republican lawmakers are orchestrating an unprecedented power grab to weaken incoming Democratic Governor Tony Evers before he takes office. In an extraordinary move that some are calling a legislative coup, Republican legislators have worked throughout the night to pass a sweeping package of lame duck bills to give power to the Republican-controlled legislature before Republican Governor Scott Walker leaves office in January. Republicans in both houses worked throughout the early morning to gather enough votes to pass the bills. Both houses are still in session now. At 7 a.m. Eastern Time, the Associated Press reported that the Wisconsin Senate passed a measure to limit the power of the Democratic governor and attorney general-elect and restrict early voting periods. Earlier Wednesday morning, the Senate and Assembly passed a bill enacting a Medicaid work requirement and limiting the incoming governor's ability to change state laws that require able-bodied adults without children to work in order to receive public benefits. On Tuesday, protesters took to the state capitol in Madison for a second day to oppose the power grab.
Protect our votes!
The legislature is also considering measures to move up the 2020 presidential primary election to help a far-right judge remain on the state Supreme Court and allow the legislature to sidestep Wisconsin's incoming Democratic Attorney General in certain legal battles. This is Democratic State Representative Chris Taylor speaking Monday.
Ever in the history of the state of Wisconsin has there been an extraordinary session convened to take away the powers of a newly elected governor and a newly elected attorney general.
Republican lawmakers are making a similar push for power with lame duck bills in Michigan. These actions are in part modeled after a Republican power grab in North Carolina 2 years ago, when the Republican-controlled legislature weakened the incoming Democratic Governor Roy Cooper's ability to appoint cabinet members, among other actions. Well, for more, we're going to Madison, Wisconsin. We're joined by Ruth Conniff, editor-at-large of the Progressive magazine, which is based there. Her most recent piece headlined, "Wisconsin Republicans Make Unprecedented Power Grab, the People Push Back." Ruth, welcome to Democracy Now! I assume you've been up all night, at least the legislators have. What is happening in the Wisconsin legislature?
Well, what's happening in the Wisconsin legislature continues to unfold. But as of 4 o'clock this morning, the legislature had managed to pass the first of this raft of bills to grab power from the incoming governor, Tony Evers, before he takes office. And the bill that is going to go to Scott Walker's desk next is the bill that insists on work requirements for Medicaid recipients and, more broadly, gives the legislature power to review all federal waivers that the governor might want to seek to get out of, that Scott Walker sought. So that's very significant because it's putting the legislature in charge of everything related to health care that might involve a federal waiver. And that's a whole large, broad array of possible acts that the governor might want to take. The background, though, I think what's really important to understand is that here in Wisconsin in 2018, Democrats won every single statewide race. And our legislature is still Republican-dominated because it is the most gerrymandered set of districts legislatively in the United States of America. It's been the subject of a federal lawsuit. A federal judge found it to be unconstitutional, the map that was drawn in secret to lock Republicans into power in the state legislature. It went all the way to the Supreme Court and was turned back on a technicality. The Supreme Court found that the plaintiff in the case didn't have standing. So this is going to continue to be litigated. Because of their gerrymandered districts, the Republicans have held on to power in our state legislature, even as they've lost power in every statewide office. So they have called this extraordinary lame duck session in order to ram through a series of measures that basically decapitate the executive branch and give the legislature itself power over an enormous number of things, whether it's agencies, whether it's making the attorney general come to the legislature and specifically to a committee, with a Republican-dominated committee within the legislature to get permission to pursue lawsuits, whether it's settlement money potentially in lawsuits. That's all controlled by the legislature now. And then limiting early voting, which is very significant because Wisconsin had record turnout in 2018. And because of early voting, which the legislature had tried to cut off, and then a federal judge intervened and said, no, it's unconstitutional, there were enormous numbers of Wisconsin citizens who voted early. And the legislature is now, and both houses have passed this, they need to get together on it, but they have limited early voting to 2 weeks. So instead of 6 weeks, as it was here in Dane County, where we had presidential level turnout, they're going to have 2 weeks. And again, it's just an effort to suppress the will of the people and to concentrate power in the state legislature.
Well, Ruth, in terms of the limits on the governor's appointment powers, could you get some go into some of the specifics of what is actually happening with some of these agencies? Some of them, they're actually packing with more members that the legislature would have say over?
Yes. So, for example, the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, which has replaced the Commerce Department under Governor Scott Walker, it's a scandal-plagued agency that hands out gifts to corporations that promise to create jobs. The legislature has taken away the governor's power to appoint the head of that agency. They're still working this out. It still needs to be signed by Scott Walker, but this is where they're going. And there was debate on it as I walked into the studio. They plan to pack the board so that until September, and this is a recent redo, this is as of 4 o'clock this morning, they plan to pack the board with Republican-chosen members so that the governor can't appoint the head of the board anymore, and the Republican legislature controls the makeup of the board. After September, they say it will be balanced. They'll be chosen by legislators from the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. But what they are fundamentally doing is undoing Tony Evers' campaign promise to get rid of this agency altogether, because it has handed out tens of millions of dollars in taxpayer money to corporations that have failed to create jobs.
Including,
one of the smaller
one of those corporations was Foxconn as well.
Foxconn, which is it's a big company that our state has given an enormous amount of subsidy money to, and really was a major issue in the campaign because it's a gigantic subsidy for this corporation that is not creating a lot of jobs and hiring people actually from Illinois to make big flat screens that will probably be obsolete shortly. There are a number of corporations that have received tens of millions of dollars from the state of Wisconsin. In this bill that the legislature is pushing through right now, they remove the requirement that those corporations even demonstrate that they're creating jobs. That was a requirement that they were failing to meet, and it's the reason that the public is so up in arms against this Wisconsin Economic Development Board. It's going to continue to exist. The Republicans are going to pack the board, and now they're going to take away the requirement that the corporations they give money to, taxpayer money to, even show that they're doing anything in exchange for that money.
Couldn't Foxconn well be the reason why the governor of Wisconsin, Scott Walker, lost? I mean, the touting of Foxconn coming to Wisconsin, and then people recognizing how much it would actually cost them. And Ruth, before we go on, for people who aren't familiar with Wisconsin politics, I mean, we were there in 2011, the massive protests that were held on the Capitol grounds against Scott Walker going after the public unions, the significance of what Walker is doing in just having been defeated in his race.
Yes, it is really a replay of 2011 when we saw those historic protests. What is happening is, similarly, the public is shocked to find out that our legislature, in the middle of the night, is ramming through a series of anti-democratic measures. A lot of people have come out to the Capitol. There were more than 1,300 members of the public who, when they found out late on Friday afternoon that this series of bills was going to be pushed through in this extraordinary lame duck session to limit the powers of the governor and attorney general before they could even take office, turned out at the Capitol, registered against the bills. They all of the people who came out, all 1,348 registered against the bill, except for one. There was one person in favor, testified all night long in dramatic hearings. And then when they were locked out of the chamber by Republicans who wanted to keep the public out, were pounding on the doors and chanting. There was a huge rally outside the Capitol. It was very reminiscent of 2011. And the same thing is at stake here. It is really a cabal of people in our state legislature trying to seize power and consolidate power for themselves and override basic democratic processes. In 2011, they ignored the open meetings law and they rammed through legislation without giving Democrats time to consider it. And now what's going on is very similar. 80 appointments. Governor Scott Walker has made 80 appointments in this extraordinary session since Monday without any public hearings and without any disclosure of their financial interests. So he is packing the University of Wisconsin Board of Regents. He is packing the Public Service Commission. He is packing the Wisconsin Economic Development Board with his friends and cronies before the new governor can come in. And this is expressly against what was discussed in the campaign. The people of Wisconsin elected a Democratic governor who was very clear he was going to eliminate that Economic Development Board and he was going to expand access to health care. That one of the things the legislature has done is to make sure that the new Attorney General does not have the power to withdraw Wisconsin from a federal lawsuit that opposes the Affordable Care Act. So there's just a huge effort here to prevent the will of the people from being enacted by this new administration.
And Ruth, what's happening in Wisconsin is not just happening there. In Michigan, Republican state legislators have also introduced several bills designed to clip the powers of the governor, attorney general, and secretary of state after Democrats took all three offices in the midterm elections. One bill would allow the state legislature to get involved in any state legal proceedings which historically fell to the governor and the state attorney general. So it seems that if Wisconsin succeeds, there are going to be other states following in its footsteps.
And even in addition to that, I would add that it is a national strategy. What we're seeing in Wisconsin and Michigan is a national strategy by Republicans who are losing their hold on power after the 2018 elections. They see a wave that is trying to push back Republicans, and the response to that is to try to undo democracy. It's to try to limit voting. It's to try to very specifically bring in private attorneys, and this is happening both in Wisconsin and in Michigan, bring in private attorneys to replace the Attorney General who represents the public. And in Wisconsin, this is an issue, and in Michigan, this is an issue because they're going to bring these private attorneys into court to represent the legislature, which is Republican dominated, instead of allowing the executive and the Attorney General, who are Democrats, to pursue those lawsuits as they always have, to make decisions about which lawsuits to pursue and to show up in court. And just now in the Wisconsin legislature, there was a Republican senator standing up and saying they ought to be able to hear from both sides. A judge ought to be able to sit there and see the Attorney General representing the state of Wisconsin and a private attorney representing the Republicans in the legislature arguing against the state's position right there in the same courtroom, which is chaotic. You have one side that's represented by two opposing points of view. So this is, I believe, very clearly a national strategy.
In Michigan, it's also interesting just to note that all three leaders, incoming Democratic leaders in Michigan, are women, which is a first for Michigan. You have Gretchen Whitmer, the governor-elect. You have Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State, and Dana Nessel, the Attorney General. One of the first times, I think, in the country anywhere that the top three leaders of a state are going to be women.
All women, all won by big, healthy margins, and all are pushing back against the same agenda we've seen in Wisconsin, which is the disempowerment of unions and the interests of the wealthy, represented by a Republican legislature that is pushing through major tax cuts for corporations and very wealthy individuals, also part of the package in Wisconsin that we're seeing right now, and that is trying to subvert public education, pouring public money into private schools. That's a major issue both in Michigan and Wisconsin. So undoing the public sphere, concentrating power, and cutting taxes for the wealthy. And you see the public's response. Looking at what's happened over the last 8 years here in Wisconsin, we see our roads crumbling. We see people losing access to health care. We see our schools suffering from massive budget cuts. And the public has really spoken on this. And they've asked to remove Scott Walker from office. They've elected Democrats at every level, and they're ready for a more humane state and a better future. And instead, what we're getting is an enormous number of private attorneys who the Republicans in the legislature now want to hire to represent committees and members of the legislature and legislative staff to do their business in secret, to hold negotiations that could be subject to attorney-client privilege when it comes to lawsuits that are filed against the state or decisions that the Attorney General would want to make but would have to consult with the legislature about lawsuits that he would pursue. So you see this secrecy and a lot of public expenditure on private attorneys in order to concentrate power for these Republicans and their wealthy friends.
Ruth, and in terms of public expenditures, could you talk about the effort to add another primary in 2020, change the date of the presidential primary, and what the meaning of that is?
Well, this is the one piece of this package of legislation that did not make it out of committee. So it seems that the Republicans have been shamed into dropping their effort to change the date of Wisconsin's presidential primary. And what's interesting about it is there is a Republican incumbent judge on the state Supreme Court, and we elect our state Supreme Court justices here in Wisconsin. He was appointed by Scott Walker, and he will have to face the public in an election that will come up at the same time that we're holding a presidential primary. So what the Republicans did was to propose moving the election for the state Supreme Court off the date of the presidential primary. So they would hold two elections in very quick succession at enormous expense with potentially overlapping early voting. This is the origin of curtailing early voting, to make sure that you can't go and vote for your presidential candidate in the primary and also vote for that state Supreme Court justice. There was so much news about this and so much protest that it never made it out of the Joint Finance Committee. That doesn't mean it won't come up again on the floor. And it's starting to get light outside, so maybe they won't try to include that in their package now. But I think what what that shows, first of all, they were willing to spend $7 million over the objections of nearly every single local election official in the state to separate these elections for no reason except to protect a Republican justice from facing a high turnout electorate. And I think what it really shows is that public pressure and really bad national headlines shamed the Republicans into ramping that back. And what we're seeing now is, they have been readjusting these bills as they work through the night. They were still writing bills, rewriting bills, and trying to get their caucuses together at midnight. And at 4 o'clock, they began to bring out new versions of these bills. So for now, it seems like Wisconsin is going to go ahead and have one election in the spring that will include the presidential primary and the Supreme Court race.
And, well, I mean, these are legislators voting. So in the new session, a new set of legislators can vote. Is there any way this could be turned back?
Well, the Republicans, this is what you have to understand about Wisconsin. The Republicans, although they lost overwhelmingly, and they lost every single statewide race in 2018, they held on to power in the legislature. There's been virtually no change in the makeup of both houses of the Wisconsin state legislature. And the reason for that is that although many more Wisconsinites voted Democratic than Republican in 2018. The Republicans actually picked up some seats in the legislature because they have drawn a map in which they have gerrymandered their districts so that they have packed all the Democrats together in one small district, and they have stretched out the Republican districts to include every Republican they can find in their area. And this has been the subject of a federal lawsuit, and the federal judge ruled against Wisconsin, said it was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court on appeal turned it back to the federal court. So this will come up again. And then the big threat for Republicans in Wisconsin is that in 2020, after the census, they're going to have to draw new maps. And those new maps are going to have to pass an executive who is a Democrat. So they will not be able to do what they did in 2010, which is to go into a back room in a law firm that was friendly to Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, draw secret maps, and then ram them through, only to be found that they were unconstitutional. And that's where I think all of the things that the Republicans in Wisconsin are doing now will come back to bite them. And just like Republicans across the country, they're facing a demographic wave that's against them. They're facing popular opinion that's against them. And they're doing everything they can to consolidate and hang on to power at the last minute. But ultimately, they will have to face the voters. And so this legislature is not going to change in this session. And they're going to try to run the state and take powers away from the governor. But they are not. It is a bad long-term strategy. And I spoke to many Republicans who came out to the Capitol to say they would never vote Republican again after watching this kind of self-serving behavior. So they're losing their own constituents with these maneuvers.
Ruth Conniff, we want to thank you for being with us, editor-at-large of the Wisconsin-based magazine The Progressive. Her most recent piece we will link to, Wisconsin Republicans Make Unprecedented Power Grab, The People Push Back. When we come back, Rick MacArthur, author of Second Front, Censorship and Propaganda in the Gulf War. We look back at George H.W. Bush's legacy when it comes to the Gulf War. Stay with us. Sleep, my child, an Iraqi lullaby. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, a national day of mourning has been declared following the death of former President George H.W. Bush, who died Friday at the age of 94. The post office and other federal agencies are closed for the day. A funeral service for Bush is being held today at the Washington National Cathedral. Former Presidents Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, and Bush's son, George W. Bush, will attend, as will President Trump, who was not invited to speak. Former Florida Governor Jeb Bush explained why President Trump was not speaking by saying, quote, "It's because we have a unique circumstance here. My brother was president, first dibs," as we used to say. A second funeral will be held on Thursday in Houston, where George H.W. Bush will be buried. Well, we continue now to look back at the legacy of the 41st president. Bush only served one term in the Oval Office, but the blowback from his 1991 invasion of Iraq is still being felt today. Although the Gulf War technically ended in February 1991, the U.S. war on Iraq would continue for decades, first in the form of devastating sanctions, and then in the 2003 invasion launched by George H.W. Bush's son, George W. Bush. Thousands of U.S. troops and contractors remain in Iraq today.
We look back now at a largely forgotten aspect of Bush's war in Iraq, the vast domestic propaganda campaign that occurred in the United States before the invasion began. The story centers on a young Kuwaiti woman named Nayira. On October 10, 1990, the 15-year-old girl gave riveting testimony before Congress about the horrors inside Kuwait after Iraq invaded.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Nayira, and I just came out of Kuwait. My sister, with my 5-day-old nephew, traveled across the desert to safety. There was no milk available for the baby in Kuwait. They barely escaped when their car was stuck in the desert sand, and help came from Saudi Arabia. I stayed behind and wanted to do something for my country. The second week after invasion, I volunteered at the Al-Adan hospital with 12 other women who wanted to help as well. I was the youngest volunteer. The other women were from 20 to 30 years old. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying. I could not help but think of my nephew.
Nayira's testimony was rebroadcast across the country and marked a turning point in public opinion on going to war. President George H.W. Bush repeatedly cited her claims.
They had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
3 months after Nayira testified, President George H.W. Bush launched the invasion of Iraq. But it turned out Nayira's claims weren't true. No human rights group or news outlet could confirm what she said. It also turned out Nayira was not just any Kuwaiti teenager. She was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States, Saad Nasir al-Sabah. She had been coached by the public relations firm Hill & Knowlton, which was working for the Kuwaiti government. We're joined now by the journalist who first revealed Nayira's identity, Rick MacArthur, the president and publisher of Harper's Magazine, the author of the book Second Front, Censorship and Propaganda in the 1991 Gulf War. I mean, so, you know, as we said, this is as a turning point. You have this teenager, this girl saying she witnessed this, that Iraqi soldiers came into Kuwait and ripped babies out of Kuwaiti incubators. But she was only referred to as Nayira at the time of the testimony. It wasn't Nayira al-Sabah, so you would know that she's the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador who also testified in that hearing.
Correct. That's all part of the propaganda plan, is to maintain her anonymity, to protect her and her family against reprisals in Kuwait. That was the cover story. But of course, nobody bothered to try to find out who she really was. They just bought the story hook, line, and sinker, even though at the time there were a couple of human rights investigators who were becoming suspicious. I got onto the trail after the war, unfortunately, and was able to run down what really had happened, which was that Hill and Knowlton selected her as a persuasive witness to this atrocity, and it was all part of a campaign to turn Saddam Hussein, at least in the public consciousness, into Adolf Hitler. And the feeling was that they couldn't sell the Gulf War without this. In other words, they had to cheat to win. And that's what interests me about the eulogies for George Bush. He's being presented now as this paragon of kind of WASP respectability and integrity, old school, when in fact he had a violent side to him, a very angry and violent and ruthless side to him. And when you see him doing the propaganda, using the Hill and Knowlton disinformation, you see a side of a politician that's kind of ugly. And we're still, as Juan said, we're still living with the consequences of our having placed troops in Saudi Arabia, because that's what sets off bin Laden, finally.
And Rick, in terms of most people, it's been over a quarter century now. Most people don't recall the climate then, but there was significant public opposition to the United States going into Iraq to beat back the invasion of Kuwait, and the vote to approve the military action was very close, wasn't it? So this was crucial. This testimony.
Precisely. You got to remember, in 1990-91, we're only 15 years after Vietnam, and there's still this very, very bad feeling in the country that's represented in Congress by senators like John Kerry, that we were conned into Vietnam. It was an undeclared war, and we weren't going to get conned again into another a phony war or a phony pretext. And so it was clear that Bush was going to have to get congressional authorization for liberating Kuwait. And so the vote was going to be very close. It ended up being 52-47. It would have been 52-48 if Alan Cranston, the senator from California, had come back to Washington to vote. He said he would have voted if it was close. He was undergoing chemotherapy in California. And it's clear that numerous representatives and senators cited the baby incubator atrocity, which was false. It never happened. As a reason for voting for the Gulf War resolution. In other words, these are people who said, well, look, we could figure out other ways to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, economic sanctions, negotiations. There was a feeling that this was about oil. It wasn't about principle, even though Bush posed it as a matter of international law. But these people said, finally, look, if he's really Hitler, if he's really capable of having an army that slaughters, and it got to hundreds of babies by the time Amnesty International gave its official seal of approval to the story.
No, that's
and I
it was inflated.
That's
it got even bigger.
very important about Amnesty International and the role that it played. It wasn't just Naira.
It wasn't just Naira. Human Rights Watch fell for it. They were neutral officially. But Amnesty International actually put the number over 300 babies. There weren't that many incubators in Kuwait City hospitals. Now, if you want to go back over the record, you'll see how badly the media, how badly the press failed in all this.
Well, I remember my newspaper, the New York Daily News, had a front page. They killed the babies, so the media uncritically accepted this story without any kind of check.
And if he's a baby killer, then, well, reasonable people can disagree about how to enforce international law, how to prevent countries from invading other countries. But we have to draw the line at baby killing. And after the war, it's not just me. It's John Martin who did the really good reporting. He went around to all the hospitals for ABC News and did what a reporter should do, unfortunately too late, interviewed hospital personnel, doctors, did a very thorough job. Nobody could cite one instance of a baby being pulled from an incubator by Iraqi soldiers and killed. There were babies killed because of neglect and because of the American bombardment of Kuwait and of Iraq. because a lot of hospital personnel fled. There were casualties. There were infants who died. But there were no babies killed by being pulled from incubators. It never happened.
And this was, I think, as you know, the beginning of a new effort at increased effort at the propaganda campaigns of our government to justify war.
Right. And this is something that hasn't been explored enough. Again, we go back to George Bush's alleged WASP integrity and respectability. Well, he's also the father of George W. Bush, who took the propaganda campaign a couple of steps further with Saddam's fake atomic bomb program. Never happened, never existed in the time that we said it was going on. He may have had ambitions before, but there certainly was no atomic bomb program in 2002, 2003. But we've now gotten so used to debating whether we should go to war or not based on fake news. I'm sorry to quote Donald Trump, but false information, that we don't know how to discuss these subjects anymore. And the war-making power has been taken out of the hands of the people, almost been taken out of the hands of the Congress. It's almost quite, somebody said to me earlier, why did Bush bother to ask Congress for permission to invade Iraq in 1991? Well, back then we were still a little bit more of a constitutionally ruled country. And there was this bitter memory of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and Vietnam, and the fact that we fought an undeclared war on false pretexts.
We're talking to Rick MacArthur, publisher of Harper's Magazine, author of Second Front, Censorship and Propaganda in the Gulf War. The beginning of your book, Second Front, Censorship and Propaganda in the 1991 Gulf War, is the first chapter is called Cutting the Deal. And you start with a quote of Earl Shores saying, "Some men are pleased to give orders, some men are pleased to take orders." It's really the beginning of the embedding process.
Right.
And explain this highly unusual meeting, August morning in 1990, 8 days after Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait. Of the four at the time, and you know the media landscape is so different, the four Washington bureau chiefs of the major U.S. television networks presenting themselves where?
Well, they present themselves at the home of Prince Bandar, who is the Saudi fixer in the United States. He's the sort of major domo of everything that happens Saudi-related in the United States. And he's the guy that the reporters have to ask for favors. That's who you go to for help, because the White House and the Pentagon had decided from the beginning we're not going to have another Vietnam. In other words, we're not going to have another situation where reporters are permitted to go anywhere they want, take pictures of corpses, take pictures of burning buildings or helicopters crashing. We're not going to, because the belief was, the revisionist belief was that we lost Vietnam because the American public was demoralized by all the bad news coming back on CBS Evening News and in Newsweek. So we're not going to let this happen again. And the decision was made to pool reporters and to censure them. In other words, you'd send groups of 5 to the front, wherever the Pentagon decided the front happened to be that day. They would get to take pictures and describe things in theory, but their report would have to be shared with everybody else. There'd be no competition, and it would have to be vetted by Pentagon censors. So obviously, the American public saw nothing. The reporters were permitted to see nothing, and it was a kind of comical, finally, to see hundreds of reporters in Dhahran, which is where the press center was, recycling censored reports from the front, which showed nothing. There were 2 or 3 honorable reporters, Chris Hedges, Bob Simon of CBS, who went off the reservation, so to speak, and saw a little bit. but these were the exceptions. Susan Sachs from Newsday was another person who tried to do a good job.
Didn't they go to the Saudi ambassador's home, sent there by the Bush administration, even though the Bush administration was sending soldiers into Saudi Arabia? When it came to the press getting permission, they said, you'll have to get permission from Saudi Arabia.
Well, this was a way to lobby the Saudis for favors. It was still going to be the Pentagon that decided who got to go where when. But the feeling was among the networks was if we can get Prince Bandar to cut us some, give us some, do some favors for us, cut us some slack, maybe he can use his influence with the Bush administration to give us better access than the competition. And this brings us back to the present day. I mean, we're in bed with the Saudi Arabians, going back a long way. And the idea of the American media begging for favors from a Saudi prince, well, it's an ugly image. And it also speaks to the hypocrisy of the American media back then and still today about the First Amendment. I mean, there were a group of us that sued the Pentagon. Sidney Schanberg and The Nation and Harper's Magazine, we sued the Pentagon over this. We lost, and over the censorship plan. But for the most part, Katharine Graham, Sulzberger, the heads of the networks, they didn't do anything. That's all in my book also. You can see what they said about it.
We're talking to Rick MacArthur, publisher of Harper's Magazine, author of Second Front, Censorship and Propaganda in the Gulf War. We'll be back with him in a minute.
They tell us there are only two sides to be on. If you are on a side, you're right. If not, you're wrong. But are we innocent of paragons of good? Is a guilt erased by the pain that we've endured? Hey, look, it's time to pledge allegiance. I love my daddy, Uncle Sam. Our country's marching to the beat now, and we must learn to step in time. Where is the questioning? Where is the protest song?
Okay, and the corridor.
Since when is skepticism un-American?
Combat Rock by Sleater Kinney. And a shout out to today's class visiting Democracy Now! Marymount Manhattan College. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. As we look at President George H.W. Bush's legacy when it comes to war, particularly the Iraq War. Juan?
Well, Rick, I wanted to ask you, following up on what we were talking about the agreement of many of the major media companies to go along with the censorship protocols of the Pentagon in the war. Ironically, this was the first live televised war, and those of us who remember the pictures of the bombers hitting different parts of Iraq and Kuwait. So you had this irony of, on the one hand, there was censorship and control. On the other hand, it was a televised war. So the American people got this idea of these precision-guided bombs that the United States was unleashing on the Iraqi forces.
Right. Strictly speaking, it's not the first televised war. You could say Vietnam is the first televised war.
Live televised.
But live televised war, yes, in the sense that you have these long press conferences, if you can call them that, run by Norman Schwarzkopf, the commander of the overall commander of the Allied forces, as they were quaintly called, who turns out to be a brilliant PR man. And what he understood was it's better to talk over the reporters at the press conference and show pictures in real time if possible. Sometimes they were real time, sometimes they were videotapes, to show what the Army was allegedly doing before anybody could check it out. So he brilliantly, I mean, it looks very old-fashioned. He's got a television set up on the stage in Dhahran showing allegedly precision-guided precision missiles hitting their targets every time to make give people the feeling that the American Army is invincible.
Let's turn to the U.S. military commander in charge of Iraq who you're referring to, General Norman Schwarzkopf. During a news conference January 31st, 1991, he explains how the U.S. has been targeting Iraq's Scud missiles.
Last night in western Iraq, we also attacked and destroyed 3 Scud tells with F-15s, and I feel we preempted a missile attack on Israel last night. Now, I certainly can't say there will be no more Scud launches. You can never say that. But I have a high degree of confidence that we're getting better and better at our ability to find them, and I think this tape speaks for itself in our ability to find them and destroy them.
That's Norman Schwarzkopf, General Norman Schwarzkopf.
Right. And the day before, actually, they showed pictures of them, of the United States Air Force allegedly blowing up mobile Scud missile launchers, because at that point, people were very upset, frightened that the Iraqis were going to hit targets in Israel. They did get a couple of Scuds through the defenses into Israel. So they had to have results. They had to show that they were taking out the Scud missile launchers. And so they claimed to have knocked out 11 of them. After the war, Scott Ritter and Mark Crispin Miller did some good reporting and refuted this, said that no Scud missile launchers were blown up. But the mobile Scud missile launchers. But the point is that in real time, the press, the media, could not challenge anything that was said. Here's the video. Here are the generals with their pointers. How can you argue with this? And there's nobody on the ground, no reporters in the field who can verify anything or contradict anything. It's not easy, even under the freest circumstances in wartime, to confirm or refute what the government says. But there's zero chance in this war. So the American public gets the impression that it's a clean war, a sanitized war. We're hitting every target. One of the great statistics to know is that 93% of the tonnage dropped on Iraq and Kuwait in the Gulf War was conventional dumb bombs, most of them from Vietnam-era B-52s. Only 7% of the tonnage fired were laser-guided missiles, which is what they're talking about here. So
it's possible to say that it was under George Herbert Walker Bush that the United States government perfected the propaganda control of media coverage of the war.
Yes, and none of these things are new. In other words, if you go back to World War I, you've got Belgian babies were being bayoneted by the Germans. I mean, it's an old propaganda trick. So killing babies has been used before, but in terms of actual technical sophistication, using the latest media technology to subvert democracy and to manipulate people and to make them feel good about the war, ultimately. Schwarzkopf, CENTCOM, Pete Williams at the Pentagon, and the Bush administration, this was the pièce de résistance.
Your final thoughts in the last 30 seconds on the review of President George H.W. Bush's life that we're seeing in the media today.
Well, I'm horrified. There was a column in the Wall Street Journal yesterday by William McGurn, headline "George Bush's Wonderful Life," where he literally compares him to George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life, which is crazy on its face because George Bailey is a kind of populist. He's opposed to the power of Mr. Potter and his bank and so on and so forth. But George Bush was not a peace-loving guy. I'll never forget George McGovern saying to me, and George McGovern,
we have 15 seconds.
McGovern having been a bomber pilot in World War II, saying, you know, most of us came back from World War II. Most of us who came back from World War II had enough. Bush didn't get enough. Didn't get enough violence.
We're going to have to leave it there. Rick MacArthur, publisher of Harper's Magazine, author of Second Front. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.